Alright, my art people, this video is showing us how we're finishing up our great waves. The first step I show is cutting out the main first wave that we made and then cutting out Mount Fuji. We're cutting out 3 different parts, the main wave, Mount Fuji, and the second wave we made. We're going to glue them down in layers to pretend like we're making a layered print, just like Hokusai did. So I want to be very careful when I'm going over all the zigzags. I know it shows me going very fast, but it's because I sped up the video. Going right on my lines, being very careful, bubble cut around Mount Fuji, and then cut all the way around on the lines. Those parts are done, and now I'm going to cut out my second wave, cutting right on the line, because if I mess up, there's nothing really I can do because I'm cutting right in the middle of my creation. Now I have all 3 parts cut out, and now I'm ready to paint. I have 2 colors, and I'm going to start with dark blue first. I'm going to set everything else off to the side, and I'm going to have my main wave ready to paint. For the paint, we want to make sure to get a nice dark blue, so I'm making sure to use less water and more paint. I'll use more paint as I paint along. I'm painting the main part to my wave first, and with this bigger paintbrush, I'm also getting close to inside of those V's from the crashing part that I made, but I'm not painting all the way up to it because I know that my big paintbrush can't make it in there very well. I'm going to use a small paintbrush for that later. There's my small paintbrush, and I'm painting inside those little tiny V's. I'm grabbing as much paint as I can because I want it to be darker, like it's a shadow. Now that I'm done with my blue, I can grab my turquoise, and I'm using this to make my darker areas more dark and colorful. I'm being very careful when I go up into those V's, and I'm grabbing as much paint as I can and less water. There's already a lot of water on my project from the last color that I painted. I'm using this to make the shadows from the crashing part of my wave to make it pop off my page more. Once you get done doing the dark blue and the turquoise on your main wave, do the same exact thing with the second one. Take your paintbrush, start with the dark blue, take a smaller paintbrush and paint inside those V's, and then you can take turquoise and go by the V's, and then I also paint the turquoise in some other areas of the wave just to make it look more interesting than just having dark blue. Now if you want to take your turquoise color and paint in some of those stripes that we made underneath the crashing wave, you can. I didn't because I know it's just going to take me too long, and since I used the dark blue color underneath, the water that's with that is going to make the turquoise color bleed into the dark blue, and it's not going to look as sharp as I want it. So I just didn't even fiddle with that, and I just made the waves look as nice as I could. Before I paint anything white, I'm going to take my pencil. I know it looks like a pen. I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to draw in the crashing waves that are on top of the ones we already made. If you look at Hokusai's crashing waves, he has fingers coming off of his waves. Mine are close to that, not as complex as his though. I do that to both of my waves, being very careful to not do too many and not do too little. It's just like a bunch of W's and letter V's all put together. Now when I go to paint these with my white paint, I want to be careful not to add too much white paint. Otherwise I'm going to cover up all of those letter V's and I'm not going to be able to see it later. I'm going to take a medium-sized brush, take my white, and I'm not going to brush back and forth. I'm going to pat, pat, pat with my paintbrush. You can see me doing that very quickly. It covers up my pencil marks, but you can still see them once it dries. If you can't see it when you're painting, try to wipe away some of your paint and pat right over it again. We're patting our paint to make it look more like crashing waves rather than just painted on a paper. Then you're going to take a tiny itty bitty paintbrush and the turquoise color that we used earlier, and you're just going to paint, even with the paint still being wet or dry, doesn't matter. And you're going to paint in the shadow spot, so to the left of those letter V's that we made for the crashing waves. You can see me doing just one side. I'm doing the left side, not the right side. If you do both sides, that's okay, but I want a shadow, so I'm just doing it on one side, to the left side. I'm not going to worry about painting anything else blue, and I don't want to make it super duper uber blue. I want to make it look like a nice light blue and maybe some variety in there like I just did. I'm going to do that to both of my crashing waves. Now you can see both of mine are done and I have to let them dry. Now for my background, I'm going to take my flat paintbrush and I'm going to put just a little bit of brown paint on the bottom, and then I'm not going to touch any more of my paint as I work my way up to the top. I'm only adding water. So I'm going to take just paint, have my paper going the long way just like how we drew it, and I'm painting back and forth just along the bottom. I'm not going to touch the paint anymore. I'm only getting water. The more water I add and the more I work up, it gets lighter and lighter as I go, just like Hokusai's print in his background. Mine gets lighter and lighter and lighter as I work my way all the way up to the top. Once I'm good to go, I'm going to let it dry on the drying rack. Now for Mount Fuji, I'm just going to take a small paintbrush, get it wet, and only touch my paint once or twice, however much you need. And I'm going to very carefully paint in between those V's and just paint the bottom part black. Now for the rest of my wave, I'm going to take one of those big black markers and put half of it on my wave and half of it off. And then I'm going to do an outline over the rest of my letter V's. I didn't like using my big marker for the rest of those letter V's, so I just took a regular size Sharpie and did it that way. For those little V's on your actual painting, I'm using a thin Sharpie, but if you want to use a regular Sharpie, I'm fine with that. I actually didn't like how I did it. I would have rather used a regular Sharpie, but I definitely want to use a thin Sharpie for those V's that we made in our crashing wave. We want that because we don't need much black when it comes to that. Just the thin Sharpie for that. Now that I've got both my waves done, we can move on to Mount Fuji. And I'm just going to take that thin Sharpie and I'm going to go right over those letter V's for the snow that we have. And then I'm done with my thin Sharpie. Make sure I put a messy mat underneath and draw an outline around Mount Fuji. We do not have to do the bottom because that's hiding underneath when we go to glue it to our project, so I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to start with the bottom piece that I drew, not my first main wave, but the piece that goes to the bottom. Put a bunch of glue around the back, not enough where it's oozing off the sides, just enough where it's going to hold down. If you put too little, your wave is going to want to fall off. If you put too much, it's going to look like a mess, and we don't want that. So I'm going to line my wave right up to the bottom of my paper. They're the exact same size, so they should fit. I'm going to hold it down for at least 30 seconds. If you look at the clock, make sure that ticking hand goes around at least halfway. Now for my second wave, my main wave, I'm going to stick it underneath my project. I'm going to put the same amount of glue as before, not too much, not too little. Oh, I got some on my second wave there, wiped it off right away. And then when I glue it down, I want to make sure it's hiding underneath that first wave that I glued down and have the side lined up with the side of the paper. Hold it down for a long time to make sure it glues on there nice and good. And then the last thing that I have to glue on there is Mount Fuji. I only need a tiny little bit of glue for this. This is a tiny little mountain. And I'm going to stick it right under there and make sure it is going straight. Make sure it's not going crooked or anything like that. Now for the last step to make your project look complete, we are going to do some Japanese letters up in the upper left-hand corner, just like in Hokusai's print. I have a sheet of Japanese letters for you, and I'm going to pick at least 4 letters, and they have to be going top to bottom, not left to right, like how we read. They go from top to bottom. And I know I have some pretty complicated looking letters on here, but they are not that hard if you pick some easy ones. I pick easier ones for myself to do because I know I'm not an expert at this. I'm going to draw all 4, and then I'm going to paint over them with black paint. You'll see me use marker, but I did not like how marker looked, so I used paint instead later. You can see when I'm drawing the letters that I'm drawing a bunch of tiny little lines. I'm sketching the letters because I'm not an expert at drawing these. None of us are. So I'm doing a bunch of little tiny lines, so if I do make a mistake, it's a little one and I don't have to erase my entire letter. Now you see that I'm taking my Sharpie, and like I said, I do paint these later. I didn't like how the Sharpie looked, so I grabbed my paint, and I like how that looked a lot better. When I'm painting, I'm being very careful to go right over top of my pencil and making sure that I can't see my pencil when I'm done either. I'm grabbing more paint when I see that it starts to turn a little gray instead of black. And then I cover up my marker letters that I did first. And I think it turned out a lot better. Make sure you let it dry before you glue it down, otherwise you're going to have a huge mess. Again, when you glue it down, not too much, not too little. Hold it down, and then your project is all done. But I realized that my project was not done. I forgot to do some black marker in some spots, so I definitely want you guys to do your projects differently than I did, because the piece of paper I'm using to make sure I don't get any black Sharpie on the rest of my project is kind of hard to use. So I don't want you guys to have to do the same thing that I did. So we'll make sure that we do that when we use the rest of our Sharpies. There. Now my project's all done and it looks awesome.